the destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
If I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Wednesday, August 31st, 2022. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, freelance journalist Chris Pomorski on the continued imprisonment of a man everyone knows to be innocent. Then we'll be talking to Amjad Iraqi, editor at 972 magazine, the plight of Palestinians in the wake of Israel's latest attack on Gaza. Also on the program today, DOJ filing shows that the Trump search warrant issued after evidence that Trump was purposely hiding documents. Joe Biden declares an emergency over Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. South Carolina House passes a near total ban on abortion with useless exception provisions. You'll recall that clip that we played from a couple of weeks ago, for I guess like a week or two ago. One of the most right-wing federal appellate courts in the nation temporarily blocks Arkansas's ban on trans health care for children and teens. U.S. life expectancy suffers the sharpest two-year decline in 100 years. Taiwan fires upon China's surveillance drones. Hannity, Carlson, others provide depositions in a massive Dominion voting defamation case. John Fetterman calls on Joe Biden to federally decriminalize marijuana. Also says he's not ready to debate. And lastly, Mikhail Gorbachev, rest in peace, dies at 91. Soviet leader who lifted the Iron Curtain and was, in fact, the Soviet Union's last leader. All this and more on today's program. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're seeing that the Twitch is not going.
Working on that.
We're working on that right now, folks. But if you're watching on Twitch, you would not know that I said that. But welcome to the program. I will allow Emma Vigeland to do the honors today, since she coined this term.
It is Hump Day. Yay! Woo! Right? How
You're
much
really
fanfare.
excited about that. Hold on. I've got my camera now. We're getting a little all discombobulated today.
It's also the last day of August. Always a little bit bittersweet. I like the summer, but
You know, I used to like the summer quite a lot too, because after, you for at least a decade or two after, going to school, whether it's high school or college, and the summer is the time where you're not in school. And then you start to feel in the late August, oh God, I got to go back to school. And then you become a parent, and all you can do is count down the days until the kids go back to school.
right.
And then you get depressed because you're not upset about summer ending. You're depressed that you're not excited that summer's so difficult.
Oh,
So
okay.
Twitch is back up
I mean,
there you
yeah,
go. Twitch is back
good-
up. And
good
I
to
also
hear.
forgot my little Liquid IV thing. Again, 2 days in a row.
And also, I've also forgot to refill my water, Bradley. So you might be on.
But really,
Speaking of Rob Schneider, it's like the water boy over
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
No.
we will get to that clip, ladies and gentlemen, of Rob Schneider, who apparently is willing to risk his entire career by going on Glenn Beck. And yes, it is the first time I've said the words Rob Schneider in,
What?
I don't know,
Not a hot
10
chick aficionado? Have you heard of that movie?
Great movie.
He turns into a girl.
Yep.
Sorry, I missed that one. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice, in the case where a Trump crony judge is determining whether a special master we will be allowed to look at the documents taken from Trump's Mar-a-Lago. And here's why everybody thinks this is just a stalling tactic, because a special master would go through, presumably to prevent the FBI from looking at it, although they've already looked through it. They have a special team that determines what is in compliance with the warrant and what is not. And that which is not is sent back to the recipient, to the subject. It's already happened. That team has nothing to do with the investigation whatsoever. They only assess whether this comports with the warrant. Trump's team still wants a special master to come in and do the same thing. But the bottom line is, any of the documents that it was to look at, Trump's passport apparently was in with the other documents. That's why it got picked up. But any of the documents that don't have anything to do with, or that the special master would determine has nothing to do with this investigation, would not be returned to Trump anyways, because they're not Trump's documents. They belong to the United States government, and they would go back to the U.S. archives, and then the DOJ can get the anything from the archives anyways. So it is just a waste of time. However, the Justice Department had to answer to this request for a special master. They put in a filing, and the filing showed that they sought a search warrant for Mar-a-Lago after obtaining evidence that highly classified documents were likely concealed, and that Trump's representatives, that was the lawyers, had falsely claimed that all sensitive material had been returned. So Trump's lawyers have a little bit of a problem too. They either lied to the DOJ in writing, or someone lied to them. And that might be their client, Donald Trump. Nevertheless,
that's the most likely situation.
That is also probably the most likely, but they should also probably step away, because now they're going to,
you mean
they're going to have to account for the lie.
Lawyer?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is a different set of lawyers, but
no.
This is the same woman?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the point is, though, we are down the rabbit hole of crazy in terms of who's going to actually represent Trump in this instance.
I mean,
it's me.
Exactly. I have a year of law school. It might be something I would be willing to look at, but I don't want to get Dershowitz. Anyways, here is Governor Kristi Noem vying for a vice presidential slot, perhaps.
Just touring around the country for the last year or so.
Yeah. There's nothing going on in South Dakota anyways. And she's on Fox and Friends to discuss the FBI's search of Mar-a-Lago.
And what makes this notable, in my opinion, is how Ducey responds, or what his framing is of what Donald Trump did here.
Oh yeah, Ducey is completely on the what do you call it? Skepticism train. Yeah, he's loosey Ducey.
It needs to be transparent so people can start to build trust back in the FBI and the DOJ and what they're doing.
Well, ultimately, it comes down to, why did he have all that secret stuff at Mar-a-Lago? I know his team has said that they declassified it, but that's news to the agencies that those documents belong to. And Governor, he had apparently 3 classified documents in his desk. And then the stuff, as Brian detailed on the floor, it shows 5 yellow folders marked top secret, and another one that says secret SCI, which means sensitive compartmentalized information. Those are the biggest secrets in the world. Why would he, and apparently the former president went through them in January, why wouldn't he say, oh, you know what? I really need to turn that back over. Why did he have all that stuff at Mar-a-Lago?
Well, that's why I think it's important that this is transparent and that we do have someone who's outside of the DOJ looking at this and talking to people. What is this information? We don't know what was in there. We don't know if believe President Trump declassified all this information. Let's find out really what the process is, what is right, what's precedent that other presidents have followed, and make sure that this is done correctly.
Governor, I don't think any president has ever carted off that many documents to their house after they left the presidency.
Yeah, Kilmeade's upset. I like more transparency. There's literally pictures of it.
Yeah.
I've declassified all of it, but keep it in the folders.
Do we have those?
It makes it look cooler.
Yeah.
It makes it look much cooler if we have it. And Ducey is just like, I don't know, like it's almost like some type of sci-fi movie where you watch it's like Westworld, like one of those bodies come out of the vat of latex.
I felt like
he's actually becoming like a normal human being.
Well, and for Kilmeade, I felt like I could see his muscles tensing up with anger with every word that came out of Ducey's mouth there. This is what it looked like.
But I had no idea any of this was top secret. And like how they put the Time magazine.
I know
the picture of the Time. I've got all the secrets around the magazine covers. This is just a memento. Everybody says when you get fired, you take a pencil, you take a Scotch tape holder, something like that, and maybe I would take like a remote or like a paper clip, or maybe stuff that is top secret SCI, whatever that stands for.
Sounds interesting.
And it's like when you get fired in a movie, right? And every time someone leaves, they only have one box worth of their stuff to take. It's that same box, right? It's that same box that was
It was underneath my lamp, and I couldn't see it. That's the problem. I put the lamp in the box to carry out the lamp, and the picture of my kids, of course, and I put it in the box, and then I didn't see the top secret documents in there.
Oh, were those documents about Emmanuel Macron's sex life in there? Oopsie.
Yeah, it's not like I was going to the 21 Club and waving it around. No. All right, we're going to take a break in a moment, and we'll be talking with freelance journalist Chris Pomorski, who wrote an incredible piece in the New Republic about a man who has been in prison for decades. And everyone seems to understand that he is innocent. But because of the laws in his state, he's not being released. But first, one of our sponsors today, Established Titles. Established Titles is a project based on a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds.
Whoa.
Or lords and ladies in English.
Probably better.
But that's the way I ask people when I come into the office.
Go ahead,
Matt. Go ahead.
They should offer a laird one. Lord Sam Seder.
Thank you.
Lord.
And that's right. Thank you. And Matt's not just whistling Dixie there. There's a reason why he's doing that. It is because of this right here. I have
upside down.
It's upside down. There it is. My framed established title. Like I say, established titles allows you to ceremonially buy as little as 1 square foot of dedicated land in Edelston, Scotland. So you can call yourself a lord or lady. Now, of course, you can do that without being an actual lord or lady. But then if you bump into a guy like me, who is literally a lord, and also I have a lady one as well. I got both, depending on the circumstance. You'll be embarrassed.
Yeah.
Somebody will call you out.
You're a faker.
You get, like I say, an official certificate with a crest, which features your unique plot number. This allows you to see exactly where your plot is located. And here's the best part. Established Titles plants 1 tree with every order. Established Titles does great work all over the world with environmental organizations like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. So Established Titles is a fun, novel gift, but you're also helping to preserve the picturesque woodlands and biodiversity of Scotland and supporting global afforestation efforts. It makes a great last-minute gift, folks. They even have a couple of packs that come with adjoining plots of land. If you want to give it to a couple for their anniversary, let's say, I don't know. The first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot within a few minutes walking distance and build our own small majority report kingdom there. But I am the Uber Lord. I don't know if I'm the Lard. Established Titles is now running a great Labor Day sale. Plus, if you use the code majority, you get an additional 10% off. So go to establishedtitles.com/majority. Use the code majority, get your gifts now, and help support the show. That's establishedtitles.com/majority. Coupon code majority saves you 10%. Our link was broken yesterday, so check it out today. We'll have it in the YouTube and the podcast description. Lastly, I don't know about you, but on a daily basis, I'm getting phishing emails. I'm getting text phishing scams. My friend David Dayen, they phished him and he got locked out of his Twitter account. But what a far worse thing that can happen is that you end up having your identity stolen too, frankly, which is why I got them Aura as well. It's also why I use Aura, but they're one of our sponsors. Aura is identity theft protection, fraud monitoring, and antivirus software all combined into one easy-to-use app. You may have one of these services already, but if you don't have all the tools, it's like locking the front door, but leaving the back door wide open. Those who have had their identity stolen are often shocked when it happens. Imagine trying to log into your email account. You see the passwords changed a couple hours ago, and then all of a sudden you start getting notifications of activity from your bank, your credit cards. Disaster. Scary. And unfortunately, it's a reality for Americans every 14 seconds. Thankfully, Aura monitors the dark web for your emails, passwords, and social security numbers, sends alerts fast right into your phone and email. Right when I signed up, I checked out one of the emails I use for all my accounts. I've told you this. Not only did I forget that I had signed up for these accounts, but the passwords were stolen from a breach there. And then it basically bounced back and told me that there were breaches here, so I could change my passwords. Aura gives you near real-time alerts on suspicious credit inquiries, like if someone was opening a loan or a credit card in your name. Protect your family and yourself from identity theft at aura.com/majority. When you sign up right now, Aura will give you a 2-week free trial with my link. You can see for yourself how many times Aura finds you or your family members' personal info on the dark web. And if you sign up, let me know in the comments below if your personal information has been compromised. You will not regret checking. Again, that's Aura, AURA.com/majority. Try Aura for free for 14 days. Again, that link will be in the podcast and YouTube descriptions. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking to journalist Chris Pomorski. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report here with Emma Vigeland, and joining us, Christopher Pomorski. He's a freelance journalist writing in the New Republic when innocence isn't enough. Chris, welcome to the program. I got to tell you, I thought your piece was incredibly well written, and it was really, by the end, it's pretty disturbing. It's a story of a guy named Christopher Dunn. This story starts, I guess, like 40 years ago now. Excuse me, 30 years ago.
Thereabouts, yes.
All right.
1990.
1990. And just give us a sense of where Christopher Dunn lived at the time and that neighborhood, and what ended up basically causing him to be incarcerated for well over 20 years.
Sure. So Chris Dunn now is 50 years old. In 1990, he was 18. He was living in a pretty rough neighborhood of Northwest St. Louis known as Wells Goodfellow. And that year he was charged with and convicted the next year of the fatal shooting of a 14-year-old boy named Rico Rogers, which occurred just a few blocks away from his mom's house where he grew up. Dunn was convicted basically without any physical evidence on the basis of the testimony of two very young men, DeMaurice Stepp and Michael Davis, who were 14 and 12 at the time of the murder.
They're boys.
They were children, effectively, and otherwise. And Dunn had always maintained his innocence, and both of those now men have since recanted their testimony, saying basically, we have no idea who shot Rico Rogers. In 2018, Chris Dunn got a hearing in state court to determine if he was wrongfully imprisoned. In that hearing, the judge, William Hickel, found essentially that yes, he is wrongfully imprisoned. That, in light of what we now know, no properly instructed jury would convict him. But in Missouri, if you haven't been sentenced to death, you can't make a legal claim of actual innocence to overturn your conviction. And on the basis of that precedent, Hickel said, I'm sorry, but I can't let you out of prison.
I mean, so this is full on insanity. I mean, because you track this entire saga, and there's a lot obviously in that you're leaving out in the context of that, but the evidence. Well, first off, both of these kids with 12 and 14, I guess like 25 years later, right? Or somewhere around there, 30 years later, they recant. And along that way, there are other people who hear, it's basically hearsay. They hear from those people secondhand, those two original witnesses, that they had basically lied because they had been pressured, and because one of them was facing some other, criminal charges as a kid, in St. Louis. And then ultimately they're able to bring in affidavits from both witnesses, right? And present it to the judge. And there's no other evidence. There's no gun. There's no motive. There's no DNA. There's no blood. There's literally no other evidence except for these two kids' testimony, and they recant. And the judge is just like, what?
Yeah, the original testimony in the original trial lasted less than half of a day, which for a murder trial is extremely brief to say the least. So you're right. There was no other evidence presented, more or less.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Well, just will you tell us a little bit about his original defense attorney?
That was my question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, because this has been an ongoing problem in this country. It is probably as bad now, if not worse, than it was then. But it's just stunning. Like the ease in which the lack of defense that someone facing 30, 40 life in prison is afforded in this situation.
Right. So his original attorney was a woman named Janice Good, who has since passed away. She was a public defender in St. Louis, fairly experienced by the standards of the office at that time. That office saw a tremendous amount of turnover. There was basically no way that the people working there could really investigate their cases because the caseloads were so onerous. And I think, as was pretty typical and remains typical now, Chris's attorney encouraged him to take a deal. He declined to take the deal. He said, I'm not going to admit to something I didn't do. And at that point, it seems like his defense team largely became uninterested in further investigating the case. They spent very little time on it.
Was it a team?
I quote her.
I mean,
she had one investigator, so team is maybe perhaps putting it a bit generously.
And to be clear, if I remember correctly, she had 15 other murder cases ongoing at the time that she was representing Dunn, right? Or 13 or something like that?
I don't know. I don't think we know if they were concurrent. I think she did about 14, 15 a year homicide defenses, in addition to assaults and drug cases and so forth. But she appears to have more or less accepted the prosecution's narrative of the case. She pretty much said as much in a post-conviction hearing. She said basically, this was a gang shooting. I don't know what else to tell you.
Yeah, and it seems like she also was just already believing that Dunn was involved in gang violence to a degree that he essentially denied, and she didn't concede, or she didn't, I guess, accept his own perception of his involvement in gang violence whatsoever.
Right. I mean, to this day, Chris will tell you, I've never been in a gang. And I talked to a bunch of people who knew him in his childhood, who were around his age, younger or a little older. And all of them echoed that, saying, a lot of guys in this neighborhood were in gangs, but Chris actually wasn't one of them. But as you say, Emma, his lawyer doesn't appear to have accepted that when he told her as much.
When he went, I guess it was in 2018 where he had the first sort of, I guess, the first hearing. Like, why was he even granted that? It seems so cruel because he went into that case, and you write that as they're doing the hearing, literally everyone in the courtroom thought that he was going to be exonerated on the spot. And right. I think you said at one point, like even the bailiffs were starting to talk to each other, to try and figure out, okay, what is the procedure in which we basically release this guy right here in the courtroom? And right. Because everybody hears this and they just go, there's no way you can keep this guy locked up.
Right.
So how could they give a hearing to somebody like that when there is no statutory way to release someone once it's been established that they're innocent of the charges that they were in prison for?
Right. So the story doesn't get into it. And to be honest with you, I don't remember exactly what the details were, but part of the arguments made by Dunn's lawyer Kent Gibson in that hearing would have had to do with procedural issues rather than the actual innocence claim. So once the judge rejected the procedural claims, all that's left was the innocence claim, and that's the one that kind of the piece really turns on, and which really is kind of straight out of Kafka, almost to a verbatim degree.
And we should say, I mean, you mentioned this, but I just want to make this more explicit. Under Missouri state law, if you are on death row and you are exonerated by new evidence, then you can go free. But if you're not facing the death penalty, just life in prison, you can't go free. Like, what is there? How does this story happen in 2018? Is it just that nobody was reporting on it? Like, is there no interest in Missouri? Like, there's nobody saying, hey, wait a second, this seems wrong.
There has been some reporting on it. I should say, notably by a couple of reporters at the Post-Dispatch and the Kansas City Star, Tony Messenger and Luke Nozick. And at the end of the latest legislative session, the Missouri governing body took up this question, and there was a bill proposed, but it never went anywhere to kind of close that gap. And the people I talked to in Missouri said mostly, they could bring the bill up again next time around, but it may well not go anywhere because of just legislative deadlock, other issues, problems passing laws, basically.
is there no federal recourse here? I mean, it feels like the imprisonment of somebody who everyone, including the judge, concedes is not guilty of the crime that they're in the prison for. Seems to me that that would be some type of federal civil rights violation or something.
None of the lawyers that I talked to raised the civil rights issue as such. Dunn does have a federal habeas corpus petition pending. He's filed them before, but the judges who are presiding in that area are not really inclined to look kindly on his kind of a petition. They're not. It's not a favorable political climate, let's say.
Well, be more explicit about that. We're amongst friends here.
There, as I understand it, it's quite a reactionary panel of judges that is sitting in charge of those decisions.
And how does the governor not say like how does the governor not say something to the effect of like hey, maybe I should just pardon this guy or commute his sentence?
That's what the attorney general says too. They say that's the proper avenue for this. But of course there are, hundreds, thousands of people who are clamoring for clemency all the time. So that's not really a very reasonable argument, I don't think. The governor has made it pretty clear he's not interested in these cases either, for the most part.
And so what happens next? I mean, is he's just in prison, and he's, as you write about his sort of like spirit, I guess, it's incredibly impressive. I mean, he has, I think, an amazingly positive outlook, at least as the way it's represented in the story for someone in his situation. What's the next steps? Is there any other steps?
So there was this new law passed in Missouri last summer that gives local prosecutors the means to look at old convictions in their jurisdiction, which had long been absent in Missouri. And most famously, a guy named Kevin Strickland was released through the use of that law in Kansas City. And the prosecutor in St. Louis has said that she's going to take up Dunn's case, but it's a steep road uphill, and the attorney general has made life very difficult for anybody actually trying to use that law.
So there is some sort of, at least some small sort of reform, and we have a movement in this country, nascent, of reform-minded prosecutors. There's some of that's seeping in to St. Louis, but the state attorney general is trying his very well best to stamp that out.
Yes. And Eric Schmidt certainly is a very, very conservative and aggressive AG, but that tradition in that office goes back to at least 2000. And that would include at least two Democrat AGs on the conservative side, but
how do you have a sense? I mean, this is a little bit outside of the scope of your story, but do you have a sense of like just how many other states have laws like this? Like how many? I mean, look, if I hadn't read your piece, I would have no idea that you could be so clearly exonerated in the eyes of a judge and everybody in the courtroom. It's one thing for we couldn't get in there, we couldn't convince people, whatever it was, but there doesn't seem to be anybody who thinks that Dunn is guilty of this murder that he has been serving over 30 years, almost 30 some odd, nearly 30 years in prison for. And the law just doesn't have a provision that says we set innocent people free. How many states in the country have law, or a lack of laws, I guess, or laws like this? How common is this story?
So the issue around if you've been sentenced to death you're entitled to freedom if you can prove your innocence, as far as I can tell, is unique to Missouri. But this idea of having evidence of innocence as kind of an automatic get out of jail free card is not, that doesn't, let me back up. So we talk a little bit in the piece about this U.S. Supreme Court decision, Herrera v. Collins from 1993. And the Missouri AG has cited that case heavily to argue against releasing Dunn. And what that says basically is what you just said, that just because you have new evidence of your innocence, that doesn't necessarily entitle you even to any further judicial proceedings, as long as we, the court, find that there were no procedural errors. So they're basically saying habeas corpus exists to make sure that people aren't unconstitutionally imprisoned, not to correct fact errors from the trial.
Nuts.
Yeah.
It is a really, really well-written piece, and obviously very well reported. I really appreciate it. And I don't know. I hope something can happen on a federal level. I mean, it just seems, I mean, aside from my broad issues with the carceral state to begin with, I mean, situations like this just seem, just absurd. But really appreciate your time. We will put a link to that piece in the New Republic. Chris Pomorski, thanks so much again.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be talking to Amjad Iraqi. He's an editor at 972 Magazine. Is it 972 Magazine or 972 Magazine?
972.
972. And we'll be right back to talk about the plight of Palestinians in the wake of, well, not just the wake of the latest attack on Gaza, but obviously 60, 70 some odd years of this. We'll be right back after this. We are back. Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us by phone from Israel, Amjad Iraqi. He is a editor and writer at 972 Magazine. Amjad, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so let's. I want to talk about where we are in terms of the situation for Palestinians in the wake of the assault on Gaza, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago. But let's start. You wrote a piece in April, talking about the scars of May 2021. Tell us about what those scars are and what happened in May of 2021.
Sure. I don't know how familiar American audiences are with what happened last May or the May before. Basically, towards the end of April and early May, you sort of had what began as a series of protests in Jerusalem led by Palestinians, which then culminated in what became one of the largest uprisings that the Palestinians have ever launched or ever led throughout historic Palestine on both sides of the Green Line. You basically had two core struggles in Jerusalem. One was led against the Israeli police, who were creating these restrictions and attacking worshippers during the month of Ramadan around Damascus Gate, which is one of the main sort of centers of Jerusalem's old city. And that includes also attacks around the area of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the holy sites in Islam. And that second struggle that was going on was in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where there's been a long-standing effort to try to forcibly expel the Palestinian residents there in order to put Jewish settlers, Jewish Israeli settlers, even American Jews, in their place. And during that month, that confluence of struggles kind of mobilized and really accumulated a lot of attention and power among a lot of Palestinians, to the point that you started seeing protests and demonstrations among Palestinian citizens of Israel who were inside kind of Israel's official borders. You saw protests in the occupied West Bank. And you had this kind of growing resistance, which then eventually led to Hamas intervening with rockets at Israel as part of this narrative of combating Israeli assaults on Jerusalem. And so this gradual uprising was also met by extensive Israeli repression by Israeli police, by the military, by jet fighters over Gaza. So it was a very kind of violent series of weeks during May, and there were a lot of continuities after that. Now, that was a very violent period, but for Palestinians, this was also quite an inspiring moment. A lot of people are describing it as a unity intifada, precisely because you saw Palestinians of all different statuses across different geographies really coming out in full force to state their complete opposition to the Israeli state and its policies, what it was doing in Jerusalem, what it's doing in Gaza, and basically its entire operation from the river to the sea, whether it's occupied Palestinians or Palestinian refugees or citizens of Israel. And as I'm sure we'll probably talk about now, but like those continuities kept on happening throughout historic Palestine. We're seeing a lot of the ramifications to this day.
I think, people can remember, we certainly remember the images of Israeli police coming in and pulling people out of their homes. Let me just ask you this, because it seems to me that there has been a long history of Israel, and I believe this is how the second intifada, maybe it was the first intifada, that is basically an assault on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Ramadan happens. It's obviously it's predictable. And what is it that why does the Israeli government do this? It seems to me like if the Israeli government was interested in not creating these heightened conflicts, even if they're convinced that they need to essentially steal these homes from Palestinians, that they wouldn't do it during Ramadan. But why does Israel Why does Israel do this?
I mean, what happens at Al-Aqsa, what happens in Jerusalem is usually just a spark. You know, Jerusalem is really this centerpiece of, of Palestinian life, of Palestinian history, and very much a struggle vis-a-vis the Israeli state. So, like you were mentioning, like the Second Intifada, the real spark for that was when Ariel Sharon basically went on to the Aqsa compound with this whole practically platoon of cops coming in a very deliberate provocation. Now, that in itself is not the thing that that sparked the ensuing uprising. In the end, what you've been seeing for decades is that Palestinians are living under a regime which is very complex in its design, but has a very singular rule, which is basically to maintain the privilege and supremacy of Jewish citizens across the land while keeping Palestinians subjugated in some form or another. That includes if you have Israeli citizenship, sometimes called like Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens, and you have all systems of laws against you, whether you're a Palestinian in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, whether you're in the direct military occupation or by siege in Gaza, and of course refugees. Now, this regime is the core source of the problem, and this itself is rooted back in the ongoing dispossession of Palestinians since 1948 in the Nakba. Now, the reason why Israeli forces are able to do these sometimes like these provocative, violent, restrictive acts in Jerusalem is because they can. For years, they've really absorbed a depth of impunity in being able to displace, expel Palestinians, to be violent towards them, to launch wars on Gaza, as it happened just a few weeks ago. And the regime and all, from the political officials up top all the way down to the police officers at the bottom, when you absorb that impunity, you feel that you can get away with anything, then you don't feel the need to be held accountable. You can actually wield whatever form of violence you need to on Palestinians. And that impunity is really manifested in how we experience the Israeli state. So it's this wider structure that's ultimately the constant source being sparked by things like at Al-Aqsa and like in Jerusalem.
And how do these provocations coincide with, say, elections being called in Israel as a way to just to get the population activated?
I mean, it's a little complex. Sometimes there's a kind of story about the idea that Israeli politicians like to wage wars or launch military offensives in order to gather votes. It's a easy theory, but it's not always it's not as straightforward. I think there was definitely an element of kind of political motive and political play, especially by Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, the prime minister and defense minister, respectively, to kind of show their sort of defensive military credentials in a way. But what's very indicative, for example, in the recent round in Gaza, that a lot of when Israelis were polled about that 3-day sort of operation, they said that they thought that Lapid and Gantz did a very good job, but there were actually no really significant changes in the polls regarding who they would vote for in the Israeli elections. And this is actually quite telling. On the one hand, you do have segments of the Israeli population who, are very right-wing and have a very kind of aggressive and violent attitude towards how the state should be dealing with Palestinians. But on the other hand, there's also a large group of Israelis who are actually quite indifferent. So when you end up having Lapid and Gantz kind of, launching this operation, everyone says good job, but the good job was that they kind of managed to restore quote unquote calm, that they were able to keep or restore quiet, to allow the Israeli regime to keep functioning as it is, to keep the siege on Gaza without these kind of rockets or without protests, etc. And that indifference is kind of very indicative of this banality among many Israelis and Israeli politicians, that you don't need to go over the top with your military operations as long as you just bring that calm. And so we still have yet to see how much it will influence, if at all, the upcoming election campaigns. But I think that that critical piece is also important to remember.
Is that a new is that a new phenomenon that you've observed? I mean, because I do recall, maybe this is a 15-year-old quote where, and I can't remember the Israeli official who said, sometimes you got to mow the lawn. I think it was
cut the grass.
Yeah, and it sort of feels like the Israeli population has sort of adopted that sense of that this is just mowing the lawn. We're not going to give anybody any particular credit. It's not like you've painted the house a different color. It's just you've maintained maintenance on some level. That's what it feels like to me.
It's precisely that. For a long time, a lot of the international discussion has kind of assumed that this, what we call the status quo was unsustainable. That, prolonged military occupation for over 5 decades by maintaining all these unequal systems of laws and policies, that could not last. What has actually been the case is that the Israelis proved that actually you could make it sustainable, that you're now hitting on 55 years of occupation and nothing is changing it. If anything, it's entrenching even further. Israel's even getting more legitimacy in terms of, legitimacy for settlements in the occupied territories in forms of de facto annexation. It's not having regional normalization with Arab states. So it's really disproved this kind of assumption that it couldn't maintain it. So the status quo is itself the solution. And this is what a lot of people still aren't grasping when they keep talking one state or two states. We are actually living under a single state. Israel is the supreme power, whether you're in the West Bank or Gaza or inside the state's official borders. And this is the solution. You have this complex design, but the policies are still the same. The goal is still the same. And a lot of Israelis are very content with this. And you obviously have kind of battles within the Israeli public of do you push it further by doing things like official or formalized annexation, but a lot of Israelis are saying no need. We're actually getting away with it quite easily. And this is, like you said, very, very indicative precisely that a lot of Israelis are fine with this mowing of the lawn, that we can't, quote unquote, solve the Palestinian problem, but the solution is just in constantly ensuring that they are quiet and don't bother us.
I mean, do you think that is it your sense that this is long-term sustainable in some fashion, or is there a certain amount of delusion?
I mean, to be honest, the systems on the ground have proven that they're able to carry on quite effectively. The violence is not decreasing from the state. I mean, it's only increasing. Even settler attacks, these kind of vigilantes in the West Bank, their attacks are increasing, not decreasing. And like I mentioned, the fact that Israel is now entering these normalization agreements with other Arab states, which is something that was actually kind of used as almost like a carrot and stick almost 2 decades ago. Now that's completely erased. The United States, if maybe in the Oslo period, for example, with all its with all the debatable positions, but that there was almost a sense that there was a bit more pressure to try to get to some kind of solution. And now from the United States and from the European Union, etc., they're also quite content with this situation. They're buying into this doctrine. What's being promoted in Israel is called shrinking the conflict. And it sounds like something that's trying to avoid friction, but on the contrary, the idea of shrinking the conflict is to try to rip Palestinians of their agency as much as possible in terms of maintaining the structures of military and police violence by keeping these sort of de facto agreements with Palestinian leaderships to police their own populations. And by, for example, outlawing human rights groups who have been at the forefront of advocating against Israeli policies at the UN, in front of the International Criminal Court, in front of public opinion. That's what shrinking the conflict means. And it's actually doing this very effectively. And it wasn't just something that Netanyahu pursued. It was actually continued almost on steroids by the Bennett-Lapid government that succeeded him since last year.
And specifically, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, there were Israel stormed at least 7 Palestinian NGOs, and this is the reason why they're doing it. Their strategy is to make this conflict at least resonate less, I guess. And the way you do that is to make sure that there's, I would imagine, A, as little reporting as possible about it, and B, as little monitoring of the violence by NGOs as possible. And then it's almost as if it just doesn't exist. What's happening in terms, I mean, I think you hinted on this a little bit in terms of the level of unity that is developing or reforming in some ways between Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and within the borders of Israel, Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. What is? Can you go a little deeper into what you think the Palestinian what is developing the consciousness that's developing within the Palestinian people?
Definitely, and this is a really critical point because for a long time there's been this kind of assumption that Palestinians are sort of, there's a truth in that Palestinians are inherently divided by this mass system of fragmentation. We're talking all the way from 1948 with the mass expulsion of the most Palestinians, and now you have Palestinian refugees and those in the Gaza Strip who are under a form of siege, and the West Bank under former military occupation, and the citizenship. And that fragmentation does exist, and it affects different experiences and their different rights and statuses. But inherently, all that system is still about remaining below Jewish Israelis. Now, the Palestinian identity has that national consciousness has always been there, from before 48 and afterwards. But I think what's been quite extraordinary is that despite these policies of fragmentation, which are very much led by Israel attempting to to splinter and divide and conquer the community, is actually the younger generation is being in many ways even more assertive than their previous generations about their Palestinianness and about connecting with people. I mean, you can take just like our parents and our grandparents. Our grandparents were coming out of the Nakba of 1948 when they were completely dispossessed. Our parents' generation, were going through a process of trying to slowly accumulate a bit more voice and strength in a very different context. And now when you look at our younger generation, we have communications technologies that the previous generations didn't have. We're able to communicate in incredible ways and coordinate, share ideas. And I think also this generation is we've been, also speaking, for example, among Palestinian citizens, within historic Palestine, we were kind of promised this myth of peace, this myth of Oslo, that a two-state solution was coming on the way, or that you would get some form of peace and justice. And what we actually got was the opposite. And so when this generation is really recognizing and absorbing that, and saying that we don't buy this myth anymore, we actually understand the nature of this regime. We understand that we're facing the same foe that's trying to subjugate us in our own homeland, that's trying to ensure that we can't achieve our full rights within our homeland, regardless of our status. And that was really sharply shown in the uprising last year. Now, of course, there are a lot of complexities and a lot of fissures and debates like any other society. But I think that current that was really observed last year hadn't been seen in like 2 decades since the Second Intifada, and showed that this old myth that Ben Gurion had and other Israeli officials had, that the Palestinian, like the older generations, would die and younger generations will forget, is completely the opposite. The older generations are dying or have died, but the younger generations are being even more confident in who they are and what they want to be.
And what is that? How does that translate into strategy or tactics? Like, I mean, what is the next generation of approach? I mean, with this realization, and I think it's a new realization. And I also do think on some level, like from my perspective anyways, over the course of the past 20 or 30 years in Israel, there has been a slow march to this sense where there is, not much dissent within Israeli society as to what Israel should look like. In many respects, it feels to me like as the some of the newer waves of immigrants that have come into Israel, particularly from Russia, and as Israelis decided to leave the country because they saw the writing on the wall, that the Israeli sort of, I guess, mindset is relatively homogenous based upon where let me put it this way. It's as homogenous as it's ever been in terms of its perspective on the Palestinian people, it seems to me. Would this change in perspective amongst the Palestinian people or growing, is it going to bring about, what is your sense of the next wave of tactics or strategies that will emanate out of that consciousness?
I would actually start off on the point about Israeli society. You're right. I mean, we tend to think of it as sort of like a kind of political consensus that has emerged among Israeli Jews. There are obviously a lot of differences and debates and ideologies, but pollings show that Israelis are overwhelmingly right wing, and even if you don't necessarily go as far right as like the Jewish Power Party, your bottom line is that you would prefer the status quo compared to anything else. Like that has been a major shift in the past decade or two. So you're absolutely right. Now, that actually kind of factors into how Palestinians are thinking about strategy. Like in the 1990s, the idea that Palestinians were told is that your best strategy is to negotiate with the Israelis to get the Americans to mediate and to kind of have these sort of like almost like, cross-border coexistence programs to understand the other side. But what's happening is actually that we're seeing that the other side, which is a party in, it's a side that's in power. There's a massive asymmetry between Israelis and Palestinians well before the past decade. And that other side wants to maintain its privilege, wants to maintain that system of supremacy, wants to maintain some kind of rule over Palestinians. Now, what's that meant in strategy is that for example, the political leadership represented by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and now Hamas in Gaza, they're kind of playing into the status quo. So the PA basically has security agreements with Israel to maintain the regime, and Hamas, even though it obviously gets into military confrontations with Israel, is kind of accepting this sort of status quo in order to maintain its own power in Gaza. So once that understanding that those strategies aren't working and that political echelon is not opening up to Palestinians themselves are now turning to civil society, are turning to social media, are turning to these kind of more grassroots efforts to assert their agency. So the NGO sector, for example, is a prime engine for, like I said, going out to everything from the ICC to the UN to the EU, going to governments and providing these kind of depths of analysis that are rooted in international law and human rights. And there are very prominent voices in that to try to galvanize international awareness and pressure. You're seeing on social media the extent to which, it's more important that you hear from Palestinians who are on the ground or Palestinian activists and thinkers who have access directly to their own microphones on social media rather than what President Mahmoud Abbas is saying. I think especially since last year, and this was very kind of observable in the American media, that they're even turning to Palestinians to speak about their struggle. For a long time, the way that a lot of media outlets worked was that they would tend to kind of go to the Palestinian victim and then go to the Israeli expert. And now that's slowly shifting. And it goes beyond Palestine, I think, this kind of internal process, but that's a very important step in recognizing that Palestinians have a voice, that Palestinians can articulate and narrate their own struggles, which I think was a big difference from the past. And there's a lot of challenges and obstacles to this, of course, and in the end, those power asymmetries still exist, whether you're on the ground, in terms of brutal force or even in terms of media and who gets to speak in American media. But that's a major shift that's been happening a lot. And so it's still kind of very tattered and not fully united, but you're kind of seeing even amongst all these different voices that they are shifting the balance of power as much as possible. But that, again, needs to kind of slowly and gradually build up towards a more coherent political leadership that can sort of channel all this. But like I said, as long as the political elites are blocking that door for their publics in different forms, and the Israeli state also has an interest in keeping that leadership divided, broken, and dependent upon the current regime, that's going to be an ongoing obstacle.
Which is why they stormed those NGOs, and Benny Gantz declared them as terrorist organizations, essentially, right? It's a way to undercut the congealing of power structures within the Palestinian ranks. And I read your piece on Benny Gantz, and what is so disheartening about all of this is, Sam, you mentioned just how right-wing Israelis are in mass. The leadership is reflective of that as well, in terms of just even the way Benny Gantz seemingly branded himself as a different flavor. The ideology is still inherently the same, which is one of brute militarism and of Palestinian subjugation. That just because it's presented in a different way, it doesn't, in practice, really change the trajectory that this is on.
It's exactly that. Like I said, I mean, and Gantz, Benny Gantz, the current defense minister, is very, is kind of the personification of all this. Whereby, you know, when you look at the Israeli political scene, I think as we were mentioning, you know, by most standards, most Israelis and most of the political scene are defined between like the center right to the right. Like that's the consensus that has really developed and formed, especially since the 2000s. And the irony is that the current political battles that are happening within Israel, and why we're now having a fifth election in 3 years, is not because there's actual ideological substantive differences. The real crux of the matter is that many of the right-wing politicians hate Netanyahu, or there's your pro-Bibi camp and anti-Bibi camp, that they have personal conflicts with the former prime minister. Otherwise, when you look at their platforms, when you look at what they're offering, when you look at what they've done even in the past year with this kind of quote-unquote government of change, they actually maintain and support the same policies and have gone even further, even in the past year, precisely because they've learned the lessons of Netanyahu's like decade-plus reign in the years before, whereby you can actually get away with all this. That it actually it helps you to push the right-wing envelope. It helps you to kind of maximize your attacks on Palestinians. And this is especially in relation to the international community, which, you know, Bibi was a very convenient character for even people in Washington or Brussels to try to put some pressure on, even though they never, you know, really pressed that hard. And then suddenly you get a change in government, and they've actually backed off. The government has been even worse in many respects than even Netanyahu. We tend to be very cautious when he pushed that envelope. And here in the past 12 months, the government has really gone wild with it, exactly like Gantz. Like Netanyahu never, I doubt he would have even thought about trying to outlaw these human rights groups, which are world renowned, are rooted in human rights international law. Like even Netanyahu would have been nervous about that. They would play a delicate game. Gantz comes in, and Lapid and Bennett and all these other members say, like, we don't need to worry about that anymore. And that's what the Israeli center represents, is that we can basically ensure the same policies, and maybe without the same dramas and eccentricities of Netanyahu, but that we will basically maintain and keep the same regime. And that's a very concerning signal about where Israeli politics is going.
I have two questions in response to that answer. Well, one, what from your perspective, what changed over those 20 years? I mean, in terms of, and also I want to get a sense of whether these centrists come in and in some measure they get away with more because they don't have the same sort of like branding baggage, yes, that Netanyahu had. But I wonder also if it is a function of we are now at like full circle in terms of U.S. disengagement, that it feels like it is at its lowest. The U.S. engagement in this conflict is at its lowest ebb. And I feel like we have been in the U.S. anyways, on this trajectory that started with Bush, George W. Bush, pushing for sort of unilaterally these elections that took place in Gaza, ostensibly, I guess, to disempower Hamas, or maybe to empower Hamas, just so that there was some type of like division amongst the Palestinian people. But I just asked you two questions at once. But first, I guess, address like what do you think happened with the Israeli population? Because when we talk about a change that's occurred over the past 20 years, the thing that sticks out for me is that in the late 90s and in the early aughts, you had almost somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million Russian immigrants come to Israel. Many were put into occupied territories. This is a country of now 9 million people. How much did that? And then I think of guys like Lieberman, who were the first politicians to come out of that wave of people who were, fascistic, fascistic. I don't know how else to they're fascists in some way. And I wonder if that is your sense as well.
I don't think it was any one particular group of people. And I mean, the Russian immigration definitely kind of affected Israeli politics in certain forms, but Lieberman is kind of one particular sort of figure in that. There are always a lot of complex factors, but kind of two things I'll particularly highlight in terms of why Israeli Jewish society kind of took this turn. One was the experience of the Second Intifada that began in September 2000, and initially began as, we were mentioning like Sharon going on to the Al-Aqsa compound as like the spark for it. But of course, this is in the context of failing negotiations with Camp David and just a failure to reach kind of political agreement, which is hotly debated. But, this political climate gave way to this, this mass Palestinian grievance and, and seeing that nothing was really changing, that the occupation was entrenching. And once the uprising began and Israeli repression also turned forward, it turned from what began as nonviolent demonstrations towards, Palestinian militias launching suicide bombings and attacks on Israelis, and of course, Israeli tanks and helicopters and soldiers kind of, carrying out repression in some forms. It was a very brutal episode that lasted a couple of years. Now, this is speaking on the Jewish Israeli society in its perspective. Witnessing the Second Intifada and with the kind of the memory and trauma of the suicide bombings, is a lot of Israeli Jews took that as as a signal that there's this line like there is no Palestinian partner, that the Palestinians don't want peace with us, that we can't trust them, and therefore we need to go even much harder on them. And so that was their own disillusionment with Oslo. Palestinians had their own disillusionment with Oslo in other respects, but again, just to kind of focus in on Israeli society, and that kind of trend shifted towards these more right-wing, center-right policies of being like, actually, we need to be much more stern, much more unapologetic about our politics. So that's one kind of trajectory. And the second was really the reign of Netanyahu, who since 2009, had like a 12-year tenure as prime minister. And even though it's not just Netanyahu, that there's a whole political system around him, but the Netanyahu years really demonstrated to Israelis that you could pursue these right-wing policies, you can, push that envelope further, and nothing's going to happen. Like the lesson of impunity was really shown in those 12 years under his rule, and this is even with like constant battles within the right and different forms of governments. But that was really internalized by the Israeli political scene. And this is why, Bibi was very, he would even try to go and intervene on the Iran deal, and the Americans would hardly like push back on him. He would carry out like a massive military operation in Gaza in 2014, and there was no real consequences. And Israelis learned more and more that they could get away with it. And so yeah, as any person would do, if you realize that you're not going to be held to account, why would you change your behavior? Why would you even go back to a sort of even, like this center-left politics of Oslo, which itself is highly problematic. And again, I'm just keeping to the Israeli side of things. But those two factors, I think, really set this new kind of consensus, which did bring a lot of Israelis to the right wing. And like I said, even if it wasn't this kind of very aggressive brutalization of Palestinians, it's this complete indifference to their existence, this indifference to a system of apartheid that keeps them at bay, that keeps them subjugated. And even that indifference is a critical part to play in all this. So yeah, I think I would highlight those two main courses of action.
All right. So last question, that you say there is a sort of a nascent sort of different consciousness amongst Palestinians. And it sounds like particularly amongst young people who are able to communicate with each other, whether they're in Gaza or the West Bank or within the borders of Israel. How much of what we're seeing in terms of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas is a big generational divide? Like how much have those two entities, are they, I mean, just as an analogy, in the Democratic Party, for instance, there's no one remotely close to leadership who is anywhere, is under the age of 70, it feels like. Is there a similar dynamic in these organizations in Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, or Have they done a decent job of, at the very least, not making it a generational divide as much as it is, sort of, I guess, the iron law of institutions where, people are want to maintain their power, even if it means that the sort of the broader goals of the institution aren't necessarily being fulfilled?
It is partly generational. These political parties like Fatah, like Hamas, they have a long-standing history and legacy. And, a few decades earlier, they had a lot of influence, kind of like the positive, almost active influence among members of society who supported the parties, who wanted to be part of it, who wanted to be associated with it. Now, that still exists in many respects, including among parts of the younger generation. But I'm speaking a little broadly, but this younger generation kind of, for a large part, is not as wedded to these kind of political loyalties, and their experience of these political parties is actually quite negative. So Fatah led the PLO in the 1970s when it was sort of like considered this revolutionary movement. But most young Palestinians from the early 90s, for example, only know Fatah as this authoritarian government that's ruling over the West Bank, that's, again, having these security agreements with Israel, with security forces that repress their own people for Israel's security. And it's a party and a system of government that's very corrupt, that kind of plays these sort of political games to say that we're on the path to statehood, and then everyone understands that, no, the occupation is continuing with this facade of resistance. And the same thing is happening with Hamas, which is a very different kind of political party, and there is a different kind of base of support. But even with Hamas, in the past 15 years, because of this internal conflict between Fatah and Hamas, and when Hamas took over Gaza, they become the de facto government in that blockaded strip that Israel imposed a siege since 2007. And a lot of young Palestinians only know Hamas as also this kind of authoritarian, corrupt Islamist government, which has not been able to lift the siege in any way, that is, it's still on their necks in many respects, it's unable to meet their economic needs. And so there's this massive disillusionment among many Palestinians. Again, this isn't total, the political affiliations are still there, and a lot of internal conflicts within supporters of these different parties. So it's a bit of a more complicated story. But I mean, this was something that was very, again, that was quite stark, at least from the Unity Intifada of May 2021, whereby these uprisings were not led by the political parties. On the contrary, there was almost a defiance by the protesters on the streets and on social media to say that this is a grassroots effort, that we don't want the leadership to try taking this. We also saw this even among Palestinian citizens of Israel, who were pushing back against Arab representatives in the Knesset and the Israeli parliament, saying this isn't yours to direct. And this is quite astounding. Again, there's larger questions about how to sustain that kind of movement, and that there is still a need in the end for political leadership. But there is a growing understanding that these parties and the leaders in power, who are just kind of consolidating more and more, are not the answers to that. And time is only going to tell, where that will turn, and how the generational fights, even within the parties, whether that will shift anything in the years to come.
Amjad Iraqi, editor at 972 Magazine. We will put links to your pieces in that magazine. Thanks so much for your time today. Really interesting, and I appreciate your taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
All right, folks.
I'll just say really quick, too, about 972 Magazine. It is, if you really want to understand what's happening in Israel, they do this, they write in English so that it's more widely acceptable to an international audience. And I think that it's a glimmer of hope in terms of being left media from within Israel. That's where I go to become more knowledgeable about this. So I highly recommend their work.
With that said, I'm going to head into our fun half of our program. 646-257-3920 is the phone number. I know we're getting a lot of complaints about not taking enough phone calls. So Friday, I'm going to really try and do it. Open lines Friday for the free half. We're just going to take phone calls
all day.
Well, and then we got a guest coming on for the second, at 1 p.m. We got our comedy guest. But also, you're going to want to tune in on Friday, because we have a special announcement. For some of you, you may not care about it. For some of you, it may be the greatest announcement you've ever heard.
All right. Let's not raise expectations.
Some of you have not
to
heard
this
good
level.
announcements. I have no idea what the announcement is, but
I mean, it's and then there could be others where it's a range in between there. But I'm willing to bet that we will have some listeners of our program who think like this is the greatest announcement I've ever heard on the Majority Report. I think that's possible. I really I do. I'm not saying that it's going to be thousands of people who say that. I think there could be. I'm going to bet 850 are going to say this is the best announcement, not only that I've ever heard on the Majority Report, but the best announcement I could ever even contemplate being announced on the Majority Report.
And if it is, send an IM. Send an IM saying that you felt it was the best.
Yes, but I will say right up front that I don't think there's a one-to-one relationship between. We need to figure out an algorithm. Between how many does one IM represent?
Data analytics.
We need Nate Silver on the case.
But in the meantime, so that'll be on Friday. So all you people don't, bitching about you don't taking enough phone calls. You don't take enough phone calls. Blah blah blah. We'll take a bunch of phone calls during the free half of the program on Friday. Also, just a reminder. If you want to support this program, I want to help this show survive and thrive, become a member. Join themajorityreport.com. Not only get the free show, you get the free show free of commercials, and then you get the fun half. Somebody's asking if Dennis Prager is becoming a regular contributor to the Majority Report. You're just going to have to tune in. Are we finally getting Mark Maron to host on Fridays? Best news ever, indeed. Yes. Okay, I appreciate it. I realize I've unleashed the
Pandora's box.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Matt, what's happening in the Matt Leckian media universe?
We had a left reckoning last night. For tonight, for patrons, we are doing a sort of members chat. The second time we've done this for our solidarity and above patron members. So patreon.com/left reckoning. Also on October 23rd, give them a revolution. This is revolution. Give them an argument, and left reckoning will all be live in Los Angeles.
Whoa.
Yeah, so check that out. I actually haven't. I was going to talk to you. I'm going to request that time off.
October 23rd. We got a big thing scheduled on October.
On the 23rd. on Sunday, October 23rd.
Yeah, we're
whoops. Sorry, can't go.
But go buy tickets to that, folks.
All right, folks. There you have it. We'll have a link to that in our podcast and YouTube description, and also we'll clarify the dates. All right. See you in the fun half. 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, and I don't think it's going to be the same as it looks like in 6 months from now, and I don't know if it's necessarily going to be better 6 months from now than it is 3 months from now. But I think around 18 months out, we're going to look back and go like, wow. What? What is that going on? It's nuts. Wait a second. Hold on for a second.
The Majority Report.
Emma, welcome to the program.
Hey.
Matt.
What is up, everyone?
Nomiki.
You did it. Let's go, Brandon.
Let's go, Brandon.
Bradley, you want to say hello?
Sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm just a random guy.
It's all the boys today.
Fundamentally false.
No, I'm sorry. Women's
Stop talking for a second. Now let me finish.
Where is this coming from, dude?
But dude, you want to smoke this 7A?
Yes.
Hi, me? Is this?
Yes.
Is this me?
Is it me?
It is you.
Is this me? Hello, is this me?
I think it is you. Who is you? No sound. Every single freaking day. What's on your mind?
Sports.
We can discuss free markets and we can discuss capitalism.
I'm gonna go throw up.
Libertarians. They're so stupid though. Common sense says, of course.
Gobbledygook.
We fucking nailed him.
So What's 79 plus 21?
Challenge met.
I'm positively quivering.
I believe 96, I want to say.
857-210-35 501 1 half 3 8s
9/11, for instance.
$3,400, $1,900.
5 4 $3 trillion sold. It's a zero-sum game.
Actually, you're making me think less of it.
But let me say this. Poop.
You call it satire. Sam goes, it's satire.
On top of it all, my favorite part about you is just like every day, all day, like everything you do.
Without a doubt. Hey, buddy, we see you. All right, folks.
It's just the week being weeded out, obviously.
Yeah, sun's out, guns out. I don't know.
But you should know.
People just don't like to entertain ideas anymore.
I have a question. Who cares?
Our chat is enabled, folks.
I love it.
I do love that.
Look, gotta jump. Gotta be quick. I gotta jump.
I'm losing it, bro.
2 o'clock. We're already late, and the guy's being a dick. So screw him. Sent to a gulag?
Outrageous.
Like, what is wrong with you?
Love you, bye.
Love you. Bye-bye. Such a long, drawn-out story. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is the fun half of the program. Let's read a couple of the IMs anticipating the big announcements. All right, let's see. Okay. We're finally getting Mark Maron to host. This announcement of an exciting future announcement is the best announcement I've heard all day, says I'd love that. Illuminati Kid says, at least guaranteed this big announcement will be a lot more crowd-pleasing than the last one.
What was the last one?
I don't know. Sun Tolp, the announcement of the special announcement on Friday is the best announcement I've heard on the show. People got that. Sam's upholstered stools. Atlanta live show?